introducing our wonderful moderator, Mr. Rufus Williams, who has been one of our cherished partners since the West Side Project began at Hull-House with BBF Family Services and their youth, who do so many extraordinary things that I'm sure he can tell you more about, and is also a native West Sider, which I'm sure he will share, from North Lawndale, I believe. Rufus Williams is president and CEO of BBF Family Services, formerly known as the Better Boys Foundation. He's a Chicago native who has more than 35 years of financial experience and has also been a corporate manager, entrepreneur, and leader in civic and philanthropic organizations. Mr. Williams began his career at Arthur Andersen & Co. after graduating from Southern University and A&M College in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He left Arthur Andersen to join Baxter Healthcare as corporate audit manager, after which he joined Oprah Winfrey's Harpo Inc. At Harpo, Williams served in many capacities, including vice president, controller, and chief financial officer. He also managed Ms. Winfrey's philanthropic efforts. Currently, he leads BBF, a human services nonprofit organization that provides education, employment, mentoring, family services, recidivism reduction, and diversion and community engagement programs. A leader who has long engaged in civic causes, Williams is a past president of the Chicago Public Schools Board of Education. He has also served as president of the Children First Fund for inner city athletic equipment, Whitney Young Magnet High School, local school council, and BBF Board of Directors, as well as treasurer of Francis W. Parker School and the Providence Street Middle School. In addition to his professional and philanthropic endeavors, he co-hosts issue-oriented talk shows on WVON radio. Please join me in welcoming Rufus Williams.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good evening. Good evening. So this is going to be somewhat interactive, so your energy is going to be important to help us work through what could otherwise be some really interesting conversation. Thank you, Jennifer, for that introduction. I wish my mother was here to hear it, because she never hears what I write. I met Jennifer about 4 years ago. She called over. I just started at BBF almost 4 years ago, and she called over because she was doing this thing on making the West Side. And she had gotten some organizations involved, and the reality was there had never been a history of the West Side that had been documented. And so she was working on that, and the Hull-House was working on that, and I was excited about it. She was new to Chicago, so I think I gave her about 8 to 10 books on Chicago that she should read. Just, you need to read this, you need to check this, you need to do that, which just led to a lot of more conversation, and BBF ended up being one of the partners in the process. And part of the process had a forum take place here, not much different than today, where we talked about issues on the West Side. We talked about things on the West Side. And having grown up there myself, I always talk about my experience. I always talk about the fact that I was excited that the principal of my first elementary school was Dr. Barbara Sizemore, and the fact that she had gone on to become the first black female head of DC public schools and Pittsburgh public schools, and all the things that she taught us when we were growing up then, and how when I hear all these things about the difficulties in North Lawndale, I stand as testament to how we get through those difficulties. And after I finished talking that day, I went outside and I met this professor at UIC who said she was doing some work on Dr. Sizemore, which I was fascinated by. And then she sent me an article that she had written, and I learned in that article so much more about myself than I had ever known, because in that I understood what Dr. Sizemore was trying to do, what her perspectives were, how she was formulating this school. And I walked over to Dvorak when it first opened in 1963. So I was there in kindergarten, and all the things that come together in putting together a school is what she was doing at that time. And so as a little kindergartner, I don't really know what these things are. I know I'm supposed to go to class, and these are the things I'm supposed to do. But I didn't understand necessarily why. I was in kindergarten, then I went to first grade, but second and third grade were in the same room, and fourth, fifth, and sixth grade were in the same room. And not until reading Dr. Breland's essay that I understand why. And reading her book, I understand a lot more about the why. And all the things that then have shaped me have really come from that greater understanding that I got from Dr. Sizemore. And it probably leads to my current activism and all the other things that I work and try to do, and the changes that I try to make from being back where I am. So I grew up in Lawndale. I moved to West Garfield Park. I went to college. I came back. I lived downtown. I now live in Lincoln Park. I always had a dream of going, when I was living in Lawndale, of growing up and being able to put on a suit and tie and go downtown to work. And so now I get up and I put on a suit and tie and go to Lawndale and go to work. So life just has these interesting turns, and it just gets you ready to do all these things. So to be able to be here and talk about, at any point, about what happens on the West Side, and certainly anything that impacts education, which Dr. Sizemore infused in us and infused in our parents, and has been the hallmark of my life, has always been welcome. So I'm excited to be here, and excited that you all will have the opportunity to hear from this wonderful panel and talking about these things. So Jennifer mentioned it, and you don't want to leave here without this book. You don't. And when you start reading it, you won't put it down. For me, I was trying to watch basketball last night. I was trying to read the book, and I was one of them. I was either trying to watch basketball or trying to read the book. But I was doing both, and doing both this morning, and it's really such fascinating information in here. I did begin in the chapter on Dr. Sizemore to see what that was about. But make sure that you get it. Make sure that you read it. Tonight you have the opportunity to get it autographed. It's wonderful. And to get us ready for all the other conversation that we would have, I would like to now invite to the podium the star of the show. She is an associate professor of history here at UIC, which she focuses on 20th century United States urban and social history. When you get the book, you will learn so much more about her, so much more about what she thinks, and through the presentation she'll do now, you'll even have a shot to do that. I'd like to welcome up Dr. Elizabeth Todd-Breland.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. That's very kind. And I should also say that I had the opportunity to interview Rufus as part of my research for the book, and it was really wonderful to be able to have that exchange as part of my learning beyond what's in the archive. I had an opportunity to speak with so many people who live through the history that I write about, and that was really a gift of this work. So I'm excited to be here tonight to be talking about some of the research that I did for my book, but also importantly to be talking about the West Side specifically. Often when people talk about the history of Chicago, there is this kind of silencing of the West Side, and that's sometimes also seen in the archive. I mean, I was just thinking about that today as I was putting together some of the images that I wanted to show in this PowerPoint, that there were so many South Side images, and it was harder to find images of some of the events and things that I wanted to talk about on the West Side. But before I think we can talk about the West Side as it is today, or even as it was in the 1960s, as much of my talk, and 70s, as much of my talk will talk about today, it's important to start with how African Americans got to Chicago. And so I want to start by talking a little bit about the Great Migration, the migration of across the country more than, or close to 7 million African Americans from the South who left the South to come to the North and the West and the Midwest for greater opportunities, and about 500,000 of those folks landed here in Chicago. And as you can see from the images that are posted here, these are the darker areas are concentrations of African Americans in Chicago, and certainly the larger and I think more known story is about the Black Belt on the south side of Chicago, in and around State Street, and the development of that community, what became known as Black Metropolis. But as you can see, particularly as you get into the 50s and 60s and beyond, there's also a really important settlement site on the west side of Chicago. Some folks who came from the south side and moved to the west side, and other folks who came directly from the south into the west side of Chicago. The images above show a family that was migrating And on the right, a scene from Maxwell Street Market, a site very close to this university campus that was in fact demolished as part of the building out of the University of Illinois at Chicago. But that was a very important site for the city altogether, and particularly for Black folks on the West Side. It was the place that birthed the electric blues and so many other things that came out of this community. So just sort of a sense of how we can sort of reorient our thinking about these things. I think also in talking about education, which I'll be doing tonight, in segregation, it's important to put conversations about segregation and housing together in conversation with ideas about segregation in schooling. Housing alone could not explain the level of segregation, racial segregation, that was present in schools in Chicago. And this map is just an example of that. On the left here, you see 1960, again, concentrations of African Americans in the city. And on the right side is a neighborhood schooling map. And it shows a couple schools on the west side. You can see Spencer, May, Marconi, Heffernan. Some of these schools exist today. Some of these schools have been closed. But what the image on the right is showing is one of the policies that Chicago Public Schools put in place to gerrymander attendance areas in order to maintain segregation. So if you see May School at this point says it had 11% Negroes. This is in the early 60s. Spencer had no Negroes, and Heffernan had 94% Negroes. And Heffernan's district and attendance area was expanded so as to keep Black students in Heffernan rather than moving further into May or, God forbid, going to Spencer, which, if you know Spencer, is an all-Black school at this point today. So there were other ways that schools were certainly separate and unequal in Chicago in the 1960s. Often Black students had to attend school on a half-day shift. Schools were so overcrowded in Black neighborhoods that a group of students would come in the morning for 3 or 4 hours, leave, and a whole nother group of students would come in the afternoon, because that's what needed to be done to accommodate so many students. Again, often when there were open seats in nearby white schools that these same Black students would not be allowed to occupy. Black schools overall had fewer full-time teachers, more substitutes, more new teachers with less formal training. And during the 60s, the per pupil spending on Black students in the city of Chicago was about 2/3 of what was spent on white students in the city. Something here. So in response, people organized against these conditions. And one of the major sites of organizing around these conditions were Willis wagons. Willis wagons were mobile classrooms that were installed outside of overcrowded Black schools, again, to keep Black students at predominantly Black schools rather than allow them seats at nearby schools. They were called Willis wagons because the school superintendent at the time, his name was Benjamin Willis. And this was part of what he saw as a colorblind policy. At the time, they did not keep racial statistics on students or staff at Chicago public schools. And so part of his justification for these types of practices was that there could not possibly be discrimination or racism operative in Chicago public schools because we don't even know the stats on who's there. Clearly also an implicitly racist policy. So in response, Black parents, and particularly Black mothers who were on the front line of many of these protests, protested against these Willis wagons. The picture here on the bottom left is actually, and the right are pictures from a protest of the installation of Willis wagons in Inglewood on the south side, where parents and community members actually laid down in front of bulldozers that were coming to install these wagons rather than allow them to be installed at their schools. And these types of neighborhood-based protests, largely led by Black parents, largely led by Black women and mothers, were taking place all over the city. On the south side, certainly in Inglewood and South Shore, on the west side as well. And there were lots of similarly positioned organizers. The woman on the top right is Rosie Simpson. She was working on the south side, but people like Bernetta Howell Barrett and others on the west side were waging very similar struggles at the same time. So all of these individual protests that were taking place across the city in 1963, in particular that summer, that fall, came together and coalesced into a massive boycott of Chicago public schools in October of 1963, where almost 250,000 Chicago public school students stayed home from school to protest for desegregation, but also the nature of what they were protesting wasn't predominantly for the right for Black and white students to sit next to each other in classrooms, but really a demand for state resources. resources, for equity, as we would talk about it today. So when you saw, if you listen to the protests and chants at these rallies, they were saying things like, what do we want? Books. When do we want them now, right? This demand for equitable resources across schools. And I want to stop to say something about this. I think often when we talk about all black schools, there's an inference, whether explicit or implicit, that they are inherently inferior in some way, beyond just the inadequate or unequitable resources. And I think what that implicitly does is also say that we must in some way think also that black people are lesser or inherently inferior in some way, or don't value education. And in fact, there's such a strong and long and enduring strong values amongst African Americans, both here in Chicago and nationally, around this demand and striving for education, even when they've been institutionally neglected by some of the same spaces over and over and over again. And so just by way of example here, I have a couple images. The top two are of school children on the West Side. One, I believe, is from the 40s, the other is from the 60s. On the bottom left is an example of some early African American centered and African American studies curriculum being implemented in high schools on the west side of Chicago. That picture's from the early 70s. And on the bottom right is a picture from 1948 of the Bud Billiken Parade, the longest standing African American parade, one of the largest parades in the country that happens every August here in Chicago, and is explicitly a back to school parade, right? It's to get kids excited about going back to school, and this is this long standing tradition here in this city. So I want us to sort of destabilize these ideas of what we mean when we say segregated schooling, and the ways that I think that slips often into these ideas of inherent inferiority. And part of that is also drawing on the ideas of educators on the West Side during the 60s and 70s who were directly combating these ideas, implicit or explicit, of black inferiority. And so one of those women who Rufus spoke of in the beginning is Dr. Barbara Sizemore. And Sizemore was a longtime educator and administrator in Chicago public schools. She was actually born in Terre Haute, Indiana, and she herself attended some early desegregated schools both there and when her family moved to Evanston. And she was very disillusioned by integration and what that meant for her and her family. Often black students were automatically tracked into the lowest performing classes as schools were integrated. She knew that in the South, when integration had happened, often black teachers were fired, and that was a major fallout from desegregation. So she was wary about what that might mean here in Chicago if desegregation were to actually be implemented. And as was mentioned, in 1963, she became principal of Dvorak Elementary School on the west side of Chicago. And in that position, she implemented some really innovative pedagogical techniques, grouping students by ability levels, getting rid of traditional graded systems, implementing what today we would call culturally relevant education, teaching black history, infusing black studies across the curriculum. And her students thrived in these conditions. Their test scores rose. So a traditional metric, they're performing higher based on these practices. And so in the early 1960s, remember this is the time when this boycott is happening of Chicago public schools in 1963, and students at Dvorak walked out too. They had very high levels of participation in the 1963 boycotts, but she again was a bit skeptical of this, and so in the coming years as her students' test scores rose, she presented these findings, these achievements, to local civil rights leaders, Jesse Jackson, Martin Luther King. When he came to Chicago, he actually lived very nearby where Dvorak was located, and she was told this is not the time for that message, that this was off message, that we're supposed to be pushing for desegregation, for integration, and the achievements of black students at an all-black school is not getting us towards that particular endgame. So in the early 1960s, she was seen as sort of an outsider. She was derided in some circles and called Aunt Jabarbara. They said that she supported Willis and segregationists. By the time you get to the late 60s, however, she becomes a leader in community control and a very strong community control movement that happened in Chicago. So while in the early 60s, students were protesting for desegregation, by 1968, they were protesting for community control and Black self-determination. This is a picture of students from Austin High School participating in Black student walkouts. These were student-led walkouts in the late 1960s that were demanding community control. Several tens of thousands of students participated in these citywide boycotts and walkouts across the city. And I just want to list out actually what some of their demands are, because I think it's instructive. So some of the things they demanded were mandatory Black history courses, more Black administrators and teachers, the removal of principals and teachers they deemed racist, quality technical and vocational education, repairs to school buildings, facilities issues, more homework, which I think is an interesting demand, and I think some recognition that they understood that the education they were receiving, they didn't think it was what they deserved and what they needed to learn. And then finally, and this is something that all student protests ask for across time everywhere, better cafeteria food. So several hundred Black teachers actually joined these students in these protests, including Barbara Sizemore, and also Harold Charles. So I'm going to turn to talk about him for a moment. Later, he changed his name to Hannibal Afrique, and he was also a West Sider, a public school teacher. He was a CPS science teacher at Farragut High School on the West Side. He was also a leader in Operation Breadbasket's Teachers Division, which was a group of teachers that were not only organizing for their students, but also on behalf of Black teachers for improvements in their conditions as educators. At the time, many Black teachers had been relegated to full-time basis substitute status, which meant they were paid less, they were easier to fire, and this was particularly important in the context of civil rights organizing. So if Black teachers were getting organized and protesting at schools, if they were full-time basis substitutes, you could break them up and reassign them to other places to make that dissipate a bit. So teachers were organizing to try to change that status. And in the fall of 1968, Afrique and others organized the Farragut Black Teachers Association, which released what they called the Black Manifesto. And their demands were very similar to the demands of students. Students and this teacher group were working together, demanding the promotion and appointment of more Black teachers and administrators, an end to overcrowding, the utilization of more community-based resources, that any contractors that would be used within Black schools come from the Black community, and Black studies curricula across the curriculum. As you can see, these were very closely allied with the student demands. But I think it's also interesting to think, again, so this is someone who had worked in Chicago public schools for a long time, and at some point he decided, along with others during this period, that the liberation he was seeking for Black children, he didn't see that it was going to be achieved within Chicago public schools. And so he created, with others, an independent Black institution on the West Side called Shule Ya Watoto, and it was an African-centered school that opened in 1972. And he argued, and this is a quote, "School desegregation as a strategy does not challenge in any fundamental way the cultural and political authority of the ruling elite in the United States over the schooling and education of people of African descent. The African-centered institution building model clearly does so by seeking power over education and schooling," end quote. And he also became a leader not just here in Chicago, but also nationally of the Council of Independent Black Institutions, which were a collection of African-centered and independent Black schools across the country that got together and shared curriculum. Particularly Hannibal Afrique, he was trained as a scientist. He actually worked as a researcher at UIC at one point in time. And he was very instrumental in working with CB, the Council of Independent Black Institutions, to create their science curriculum and a massive science fair that they would have every year. So this is a picture here. People may be more familiar with Marva Collins' West Side Preparatory School, also, again, another independent Black institution forged on the West Side as a self-determinist alternative to traditional public schooling, along with Shule Ya Watoto, which some students are pictured there. Unfortunately, many of these institutions, these independent Black institutions, were hampered by financial difficulties. They endeavored to serve anyone who wanted to come in, particularly poor and low-income Black students within the communities that they served. And so they kept tuition very low, but that also meant that they had difficulties with sustainability. And most of them closed at some point, or others entered the charter sector in the 90s with some consternation within the independent Black school community about what that might mean. But to this idea of organizing and what came out of that, particularly with regards to Black teachers, this militant Black teacher activism and organizing, of which Baba Hannibal Afrique and also Barbara Sizemore is in a supporting role were very much involved in, did ultimately result in increases in Black teachers in Chicago public schools and guarantees of certification for Black teachers in Chicago public schools in collaboration with some demands that were put on the system to desegregate. By 1984, Black teachers outnumbered white teachers for the first time ever in Chicago public schools, and Jackie Vaughn that same year was elected president of the Chicago Teachers Union, and her election made her the first African American, the first woman, and the first elementary school teacher to ever hold that post. The other thing that this influx of Black teachers meant was their increased political power in the city. In the context of deindustrialization, teaching was a relatively stable Black middle-class profession that allowed people to assert their political authority, and Black teachers were a major part of the movement to elect Harold Washington mayor here in the city of Chicago. Coming out of Harold Washington's administration were the first local school councils, and I think it's interesting just to think about people's winding trajectories that Hannibal Afrique also became involved in Harold Washington's administration on these education committees. So moving between the traditional public school system at the same time that he's operating independent Black institutions outside of the system as well. By the time you get to the late 1980s, Chicago becomes this model for what decentralization and these ideas of local control of schools might mean, particularly through local school councils. And that changes in the 1990s. So in the 1990s, Chicago becomes a model of a different kind, a model for what has now sort of been talked about as the corporate reorganization of public education and public education reform. Mayoral control of schools is implemented during this time in the mid-90s, and education choice programs of various kinds are put through. And this significantly decreases the proportion of Black teachers in the system through layoffs, school interventions and closings, the expansion of charter schools, and hiring practices that disproportionately favored young white teachers into the system in these various choice models. Just by way of example, in 1996, roughly 43% of Black teachers in roughly 43% of teachers in CPS were still African American. Today, that number is down to 21%. And I think this is important, not just because of Black teachers' roles in the classroom, but also because of their roles within Black communities, as noted by people like Barbara Sizemore and Hannibal Afrique, whose importance extended beyond the schoolhouse, or the traditional public schoolhouse. Black teachers served as anchors of communities, as caretakers of children, and as a relatively stable Black urban middle class employed in the public sector. So school closings devastated already struggling Black neighborhoods where Black teachers lived and worked. The same communities that schools are being closed in that Black teachers worked at and where Black teachers are losing their jobs are the same communities where we're seeing commercial flight, disinvestment in various different forms, over-policing, the foreclosure crisis hitting very hard. And all of these things are happening in the same spaces to really destabilize so many communities here in Chicago, and particularly on the west side of Chicago, where as you can see from this map, so many of the schools, this is just the map from 2013, but so many public schools have been closed. It also contributes to this push out. I think often people talk about Black population loss in the city over the last couple of decades as if though it's sort of like a naturally occurring phenomenon like the weather. But this is impacted by policy, right? Policies of the demolition of public housing, policies of school closing, policies of disinvestment in so many of our communities that have had an ongoing and enduring impact. But I don't want you to leave here depressed. depressed or forlorn by these things. Because the other thing to know about Chicago is that this is an organizing city. And so these struggles that were initiated in so many ways in these earlier periods have been taken up in different manifestations by different groups, and particularly, I think, in encouraging ways by young people. Student groups have formed across the city to push for and put forward really exciting alternative visions of schooling. In this image here, there's some pictures of students and adults protesting school closings. Certainly the image in the middle from the 2012 Chicago Teachers Union strike, where many of the tactics that the Chicago Teachers Union were employing were the very same tactics that Black teachers had been employing, making these linkages between teachers' teaching conditions and students' learning conditions that they had been making for decades. And then also young people protesting for more funding for education as opposed to policing. And at the bottom left, a group of students from Voice who actually successfully passed legislation and pushed legislation in the state legislature to change the way that disciplinary policies are implemented, not just here in CPS, but also across the state. So I'm going to stop there to allow for my wonderful panelists to come up and join me to talk more about these issues on the West Side, and then of course to allow you all to come into our conversation as well, so this really can be a discussion. But thank you for your time.
Wow. So I was sitting and listening and filled with pride and animus and concern and all kinds of emotions, given the journey that we've gone through from then to today. So Elizabeth, thank you so much for writing your book, and thank you for sharing all of that with us. We really, as I asked earlier, for some energy. We're going to try to have some conversation around all of this, and I would love to know what's on your mind. We'd love to try to see how many of your questions we can get answered as the evening goes on. But what I'd like to do first is to invite a couple of other people to join in this conversation. The first one I'll invite up is Ayesha Jaco. She's a Senior Director of Programs for Westside United. Westside United is an organization that's working to reduce the death gap on the west side of Chicago, which is currently, if you look at Ogden Avenue, and if you live in the Gold Coast, or if you live in Riverside, you live till you're about 93. But if you live in the middle, in North Lawndale, you live until you're about 68. And so the work of Westside United is to try and reduce that gap. And Elizabeth is running programs, Senior Director of Programs there. She's also a philanthropist, an arts advocate, and the co-founder of Mural, which used to be known as the Lupe Fiasco Foundation, whoever he is. In addition to being her brother. She has provided comprehensive social services, substance abuse prevention, food equity, study abroad, and artistic programming for over 18,500 inner city youth and their families in 20 Chicago communities. She's a faculty member at the Northeastern Illinois University Jacobs Carruthers Center for Inner City Studies. She was recently awarded the Power 25 Chicago Award by Walker's Legacy and received the Chicago Dance Makers Forum Lab Artist Award in 2018. Please welcome her to the discussion. The next person I'll invite up is a gentleman I've known for a while, but only learned today that he lived in North Lawndale. Prexy Nesbitt has spent more than 5 decades as an educator, an activist, and a speaker on Africa, foreign policy, and racism. His family was a fixture on the West Side, with at one point 10 different members working at the Chicago Board of Education, receiving paychecks from there. Prexy is currently a presidential fellow in peace studies at Chapman University in Orange, California. A teacher and lecturer for many years all over the U.S., he worked as a red cap social worker, union organizer, special assistant to Mayor Washington, and a senior program officer with the MacArthur Foundation in Chicago. As an aside, I met Prexy when he was the dean of students at Francis W. Parker School in Lincoln Park, which was one of our more esteemed private schools, which interestingly enough, having grown up in Lawndale, Prexy attended back in 1954. Prexy, join us if you will. So again, Elizabeth, thank you so much for your presentation. I thought it was wonderfully take it out. It was wonderfully informative. So, as my son always tells me, age before beauty. Prexy. What were your impressions? And give us some thoughts on this, on, whatever you want to talk to us about, because you have the authority to do that.
I don't think you want to give me that kind of carte blanche. You all would be here all night. I want to say one thing right off the bat, though, and that is to say that as a historian, as a trained historian who studied in both the United States and Europe and Africa and has read countless history treatments of things, I have to say to you that I think this was one of the finest historical accounts that I've ever read. It was an account that brought back to life with detail my whole upbringing, and I only wish that my own family had all read it. I also would like to suggest that I think it should be mandatory reading for any teacher coming into the public school system of this city, and perhaps of many cities, because of what it does around the dynamics of race questions. And so I would argue race and class, and additionally, because I think that the future of this country really is going to depend upon the capacity of people in this country to learn to live with each other. And part of that is going to be based on beginning to understand each other's histories in much greater detail. And this book does that. I'll just say one other thing real quickly. My father was the dean of the faculty at Wendell Phillips High School on the south side in Bronzeville. My mother was the assistant principal at the James Weldon Johnson School at the corner of Douglas and Albany in Douglas Park in Lawndale. It is, I think, a fitting tribute to all these teachers who spent years of dedicated service in communities that were really without resources and systematically messed on by the structures that be. It's such a tribute to all that they gave to the West Side that it chokes me up a little bit. It's hard for me to talk about this too, and I'm going to shut up for the moment, because Hull-House was part of my background. This is a place that I have known since I was 7, 8, 9 years old. I played softball out on the street out there. I was part of the demonstrations that the Italian community, led by women like Florence Scala, fought against the creation of this place that was brought into being by Papa Daly. At the same time that we were trying to get this school to be situated in Garfield Park on the west side and serve a community that desperately needed that resource. And so I think that one of the things that also is very wonderful for me to see tonight is this audience of people of all hues and colors and persuasions, and above all, young folk. Because I think what you will get tonight is an arming of yourselves for the long struggle ahead. Just near here was a school called Dante School. Down the street, in the old area of Maxwell Street, was a YWCA that my mother was the head of. So for me, your opening this evening, sister, choked me up a lot. And I'll stop with those opening comments. But I don't normally push a book so much. The only other book, Elizabeth, I have pushed like I'll push your book is Amilcar Cabral's book on the revolution in Guinea. Now, most of you all probably have never heard of Amilcar Cabral, but I hope that you will leave here tonight and will make all of Chicago aware of Elizabeth Todd-Breland.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prexy. Now beauty and brains. Ayesha, what were your thoughts after the presentation, and what are you thinking of right now?
Wow. It was just amazing and nostalgic. And in my work, I'm knocking on a new decade soon. But in my work today, I'm always forced to look back from where I came. And so seeing the Great Migration, thinking about my family's migration from the Mississippi Delta as sharecroppers to North Lawndale in the 1950s. My mom came to that community in 1968, a month after Dr. King was assassinated. Prior to that, she had come to Lawndale and saw all the thriving businesses and the beauty in that community, and then saw it decimated. And she came as an 8th grader and started her educational journey. Harold Charles was her science teacher. So seeing all this is just wow. When Fred Hampton was assassinated in 1969, he instructed students to walk out and to go to the site. And my mother couldn't go because my grandmother and great aunts thought that the Panthers were gangsters because of how they were portrayed in the media. And then I think about my father, who grew up in Robert Taylor projects, born here in Chicago, and he was a Black Panther. And so they got together in 1979 and had a few kids, and we wound up in Lawndale. And I went to school at Crown Community Academy, and I never knew at the time why my mother chose Lawndale, because that's where she unpacked her first suitcase. So seeing a lot of this is just really having me think about how my toolkits got formed unbeknownst to me. I was talking with Prexy. I grew up in East Garfield Park, down the street from Marshall High School on Madison and Albany. My grandmother and great aunts frequent a church right on Warren and Albany, and Prexy was giving me information about how that was the only church that Dr. King was allowed in. And I walked past that church. I would get the school bus in front of that church. So for me, it's all about the Ghanaian word about Sankofa, looking back to move forward. Also going back to Harold Charles, who I knew as Baba Hannibal Afrique. My father, in addition to being a Black Panther, a Southsider, one of his modes of operation was to open karate schools in some of the most impoverished neighborhoods in Chicago. And so he started with Tiger Dojo and the Robert Taylor projects. And so he was reforming the Blackstone Rangers, turning them into Kung Fu masters, and just doing all of this great reform work once he came home from Vietnam. But that's what I do, right? That's what I'm doing in 2019, using dance and using health equity. So it really just took me back to my roots. And my father also taught martial arts to Baba Hannibal Afrique students at the Shule Watoto. So for me, I have picked up this baton of my family's history to sit here today to do work to decrease the 16-year life expectancy gap a few blocks away from where I spent 16 years of my life. So to be here today, sitting next to Liz and Prexy, and then learning about your history, Rufus, it's a full circle moment, and also a testament that this knowledge needs to keep being put out there. Young Black and brown kids need to know the history, they need to know where they come from, and as you said, this being a manual to reactivate and teach people. At Crown, most of our teachers were Black. I found out later that one of my teachers was a Black Panther at Southern Illinois University. We went to see Malcolm X when it came out in 1992 and had to read the book. So I think I may have gotten the last of that generation of teachers that had to fight so hard, and we never knew why they went so hard on us. We would go to the Black Heritage competitions at Collins High School that were held at that time that are no longer here. So for me, having a colleague like Liz is just another reminder to keep unearthing the history, to keep doing the work. And so I'm just honored to be here. And though I live in Bronzeville, I'm West Side till I die. And, you know, just always looking for ways to beckon the call of the ancestors and those that sit amongst us that sat in those classrooms.
So I mentioned that I was full when I first saw it, and I'll share my immediate impressions as well. When I got the book, I first opened it up to read about Dr. Sizemore, and I went to the picture on page 48, which was one of the pictures that was shown up here. I have 5 brothers and sisters, and I looked at this picture at Dvorak in 1963 and said, one of us has got to be in this picture. And so I looked long and close, and right down at the end was my brother. So looking at that and reading it and learning all of these things about what was taking place and the strength of this community that existed was just, it's wonderful. And Prexy, I'll echo your thoughts and the fact that this should be required reading for everyone who is engaged in education anywhere that requires any elevation of Black children. It is such a phenomenal sense of what can be. And I think back to the 60s, and so many programs, so many things were happening in the 60s where we were really pushing hard to make some things happen, whether it was integration, whether it was self-determination, whatever it was. So to think back to those times and think about the people who were really thinking about how to make some change, how to really make some impact, just fills me. Elizabeth, the fact that you stopped and wrote all of this and pulled all of this together, I wish, full disclosure, certainly for those of you who came in a little bit later, I grew up in Lawndale. I went to Dvorak. Dr. Sizemore was my first principal. And from all of that, I became the president of the Board of Education for the city of Chicago. So a lot of the things that we'll talk about that include when schools were closed, not all the schools, but there were the Renaissance 2010 that was going on. A lot of those things that were happening were also happening when I was the president of the board. So I often wonder, and there were a lot of pushes inside that people would not know about to come to wherever we came to, but it's just fascinating to know all of these things, and knowing all of these things going in may help people make different decisions than what they may make now. I will tell you, not knowing all of these things as I did, I think even knowing it, I would have made and pushed the same ways in which I did, just because I was studied by Dr. Barbara Sizemore with what my thinking should be going in. But with that, Elizabeth, tell us, why did you write this book? What was it about the West Side and education and all these things that led you to do this?
So when I was in graduate school, I knew I had an interest in African-American history, particularly African-American urban history. I'd already done some research on the history of Chicago. But then I realized that I was spending so much of my time not in coursework or studying for exams, working in schools in various different capacities. I worked in after-school programs. I worked at a charter school for 4 years, first as a social studies instructor and then as a high school college counselor. And in the school that I was working at, while I was sort of initiating this research, it was co-located with a traditional neighborhood public school, and the school that it was located in was one of the same schools that was part of the Woodlawn Experimental Schools Project, an experimental community control project led by Dr. Barbara Sizemore during the late 60s and early 70s. And another just very Chicago twist of irony, I was actually working at that school with Dr. Sizemore's granddaughter, because Chicago is both a very big place and a very small town. And so it was interesting to be in that space and just think about these multiple generations of reform that had happened in these similar spaces. And in the context when I was working there in the early 2000s, Black communities weren't places that generated or weren't seen as places that could or did generate ideas for change. They were seen as places that needed to be reformed by others, by people from the outside who have better ideas about what that might look like. And that seemed very antithetical to what I was seeing in this research that I was doing. And so I was happy to be able to not just find some things in historical archives, but also, again, as I was saying, have an opportunity to interview Dr. Sizemore's daughter and granddaughter. Her daughter worked with her actually in the 90s here in Chicago. In fact, I want to say maybe at Penn or Spencer on the West Side, they did some work in schools there together. And so I think that just all of those things coming together made it seem like a very pressing, urgent, and important project to talk about these longer histories that had informed and got us to the place where we are today. And how I think for me, history is important, not just because I think sometimes people say, oh, well, nothing has changed. No, actually, I believe in historical change. I think things have changed over time. I think the context that we're in today is very different than, for instance, the context of community control in the late 60s. Part of the reason why people were making such strong demands for community control in the mid to late 60s is because of war on poverty money. All of this federal funding and this other funding was coming into cities, and folks in communities were saying, if this money is coming here and it's supposed to be for us, we should decide how it's going to be spent. We should decide how the institutions within our communities are going to be run. And I think that's a different context than 20, 30, 40 years later, when largely the logic is of austerity and disinvestment and what to do and how to move within those constraints and where to get new revenue from, and what redistribution might have to take place in order to get that new revenue. But I think the other thing that sort of looking at these things over time tells me is that, yes, history sometimes seems to go in circles or might seem to rhyme, but I think history can also help us to ask better questions. It can help us to question and challenge what are sort of perceived common sense narratives of our current moment. And I think most importantly, it can help us to organize better for the things that we want to build upon and take strength from the fact that you're not the first person trying to do these things. Maybe your goal is different, maybe your strategy and tactic is, but there are folks to stand on and learn from. And I think that was very powerful for me in doing this work.
I know Prexy is chopping at the bit to say something, but I want to ask you this other question.
Yes.
Dvorak opened in 1963. Brown versus the Board of Education was May of 1954. These schools were still very much segregated then. They're still very much segregated now. Can you talk about what it was that Dr. Sizemore and others were thinking about in this whole sense of community control versus fighting for integration and welding into what that was?
Sure. So I think the first thing to note is that the Brown versus Board of Education decision was specifically targeted at Southern schools in a set of Southern states. And those are the places where federal intervention was really put in the most to try to enforce desegregation, to greater and lesser extents in some places than others in terms of its success. But really coming out of that era, schools in the South become some of the most desegregated in the country. And it's really schools in the North and West, in urban areas in particular, that remain separate and unequal. So I think there's a lot of conversation today about like, oh, we're in a phase of resegregation. Well, I would argue that Chicago public schools never desegregated, not in any comprehensive manner. There were some fits and starts, some voluntary busing programs that happened for a short period of time, some other attempts, but desegregation was never really comprehensively implemented because there was so much pushback against it and a lack of political will at the highest levels, Mayor Richard J. Daley's and his administration, to actually try to implement desegregation. In 1980, Chicago actually finally was put under a desegregation consent decree by the Justice Department. But by that point, the proportion of white students in the system were in the teens. And so what comprehensive desegregation would even look like in those contexts was questioned. But to your point before, I think part of what Barbara Sizemore and others were questioning about desegregation is really, is desegregation the only route towards equity? And I think they were saying no, that, we never actually tried either equalization or providing the funds necessary for equity in all Black educational settings, and that there already were all these different resources present that could make Black schools successful. And then I think other people would argue, with the proper funding and necessary resources. And I think that's some of the conversation that you see today. But I think her explicit critique of Brown Brown was that Brown implied Black inferiority. And she said that because she said part of the logic of Brown is that separate is inherently unequal, but white separate schools are not inferior. It's Black separate schools that are inferior and inherent. And she said inherent means that it's in some way biological. You can frame it in cultural terms, but the implicit argument is that these spaces and Black people are inferior inherently. And I think she was pushing back very forcefully against that argument. And then also about what the fallouts of desegregation might be. And you did see these fallouts in the South, the massive firing of Black teachers, laying off of Black teachers, and also what that institutional loss would mean to lose Black schools and Black institutions.
So it was actually the word inherent that troubled her because of what that meant and what that meant on the other side. Inherent was actually the word used by Thurgood Marshall when he was presenting the argument.
Yeah.
Black girl magic, even back then. Prexy, you were chomping at the bit to say something, and I want to hear what that is. I also would like for you to speak to, because in the 60s, you were of age to know all that was going on. You could see what was looking to be done, and you could see it from both inside and outside as you were at Parker, and your parents were in the system working through all that was. Share some more thoughts with us after hearing what Elizabeth said.
I think, first of all, I should share with everybody that Barbara Sizemore was like a godmother to me. She was a part of my family in the sense that there was this whole group of Black women teachers who were extraordinary teachers, extraordinary individuals, who all knew each other also, and all interacted and worked with each other all the time. So, for example, when Barbara moved to take the job as a superintendent in schools in Washington, D.C., it was the same time that I was getting hired at a place called the Institute for Policy Studies in D.C., and so I took Barbara's stuff, all her stuff. I know Barbara's stuff. So I had to drive this truck all the way over there, and
Literally her stuff.
Literally her stuff. But most importantly, Barbara later would invite me when she's in Pittsburgh and working as the superintendent of schools to come and speak about South Africa with a wonderful poet by the name of Dennis Brutus. And I think one of the things that I would raise is that while there is this question of community control that is raised, I think that evolves also. In the period of time that I was around these struggles, and I was with Hannibal, for example, Afrique, when Farragut exploded in a racial conflagration between Latinos and Blacks at Farragut. It was ugly, ugly stuff. I was very close to the Shule Yawatoto and people like Conrad Worrell, and we all had very pronounced views that came out of our exposures to the African liberation movements. There's a very important influence on all this. It's not accidental. It's called the Shule Yawatoto. That's a Swahili term that comes out of the struggle in Tanzania. And so when we began to do more and more of this work around not only making change in Chicago, but also doing international work against, for example, the apartheid regime of South Africa, all that had deep impact on the ideological development of all of us. And I think that one of the things that would be very important to look at, which I would love to see explored further, is the question of the Panther Party's emergence and its impact on schools, teachers, and students, and particularly the killing of Fred Hampton. December 4th, 1969 was one of the most pivotal points in the history of this city. Why do I say that? Because I think it was a point at which the powers that be in this city utilized all the federal machinery they could to stop a movement that was in formation, that was arguably could have brought about a totally different product in Chicago, because there was such a tremendous amount of youth pride and engagement symbolized by the Black Panther Party and all the things they were doing and the support that the West Side community gave to the Panther Party and what it represented. And so it's not accidental that that memory has been squelched in this city. Literally squelched, that there's not a single, there's one visual image that's about to go down on the West Side to Fred Hampton, while the world knows that the killing of Fred Hampton was one of the most concentrated moments of political assassination that we've had in the history of this country. And so there's a whole generation of young people who in schools, everybody walked out of schools that day. I was a dean at a small school on the West Side, and I spent the whole day, December 4th, when the murder had been announced, trying to work with students who were just distraught and who were all ready to just take on every policeman that they could, regardless of what the cost would be. I want to say one other thing. Political ideas and attitudes evolve. They change. They're affected by history and events. One of the most important parts of Elizabeth's wonderful book is the chapter on unions and on the struggle that goes on against the racism that initially characterized the Chicago Teachers Union. By the time of the Teachers Union strike of 2012, is that right? The successful one. By that time, there's another type of teachers union headed by a wonderful woman, Karen Lewis, who symbolizes a new unionism that has come into Chicago. But that earlier unionism was something that also had very deep roots. We have in our midst right here, for example, a white woman who taught out on the south side of Chicago, and she wanted to teach in African history course. And the black teachers there didn't want her to be teaching that because she was a white woman. My father, who came from a long history of trade unionism, argued that if she knew it, she should be allowed to teach it. And that was his position. That was not, I don't even remember what the final outcome of that was. But the point is that I think trade unionism per se had an enormous impact on the question of race in this city, continues to have that. And it can either be a wonderful progressive force, or it can be a force that held people back. And I think that that's one of the rich things that Karen's book gives us, is this history and the challenge of what trade unionism can be like. Lastly, my observation has been that while there are these great ideas about we have about race and this and that, what people do individually on the West Side has always made a tremendous difference. And there is a woman you write about in this book called Faith Rich. I would like all of you all to hear this quick story I'm going to tell about Faith Rich. And go down to the Harold Washington Library, and you can find the archives of the woman who did more research on these questions than anybody else at that time. She's a little skinny white woman from Vermont. As eccentric as anybody you'd ever meet in your life, but absolutely brilliant and dedicated and committed to people. Did it. And she discovered that all the neighborhood abandoned lots could be turned into gardens. This is in the 1950s. She starts going around, and she discovers you can do a garden and you can put human hair down to fertilize in these abandoned lots. And she starts going around to all the black barbershops picking up human hair. And she's distributing it on all these lots. And some of the men in the neighborhood come to my father and say, Mr. Nesbitt, you got to stop Miss Rich. A lot of us come from Mississippi, and you can't take people's hair and put it down. It makes you like a witch. So you got to stop Miss Rich from doing that. My father goes to Faith Rich. He said, Faith, this is what's happening. You can't do this no more. She said, okay, Ro, okay, I won't do it anymore. 4 weeks later, another report comes. Miss Rich is out there putting hair down again. My father goes to the back. She lives in our building, see, she and her husband. He says, Faith, are you putting hair down again? She says, yeah, but it ain't black hair. I got white hair. I got white hair that I'm getting from the Stop and Shop in downtown and bringing it out. My father just shook his head.
Thank you, Prexy. We can sit. Thank you for invoking the Black Panthers. Their impact on our nation, their impact on our communities was tremendous. And so if you haven't seen Vanguards of the Nation, it's helpful to look at and understand how the Black Panthers moved. There's also a book that Bobby Seale wrote about the power to the people, about the Black Panther Party, which gives you a real sense of it. One of the interesting things in our community, you all may have seen the movie that starred Will Smith, The 6 Degrees of Separation. What we determine in Black communities is that it's really 2 degrees. You can make one call and you should be able to get to somebody who knows whoever you're trying to get to. So as we sat and talked about what we were doing here, our links are so tight all the way through with so many things that we won't get to tonight that we know. That's really been special. But Ayesha, as you listen to all this and the work that you're doing now with the mural project and all, how does this affect the work that you're doing and what young people are seeing, feeling, and sensing through what's happened through all these movements?
Well, I would say, the community that I grew up in never recovered from the riots when King was assassinated, but I did not have that context as a young person, and a lot of our young people don't have that context, and so they think that this is the way that it is. And so for me, a lot of the work is about educating, connecting young people back to their roots through dance. So through the Chicago Dance Makers Forum project, I'm working on a piece called the Chi-Sissippi Mixtape. And so what that is a dance piece in honor of my family's history from the Delta as sharecroppers to Lawndale. And in that, there were a series of discussions where there were talking circles where I invited people that migrated to share their stories. And my cast are young people from the West Side that I've trained since they were 14, and they're now 23 in college. And so for that, they had to go back and talk to their grandmothers or dig and find history in order to be a part of that process. And so what that did for me as well is allowed me to go back and talk to my aunts who, after they left Lawndale, they came here to the projects right off of Roosevelt and Loomis, and the name escapes me. Not Avila, the short 3-story brown buildings. Gosh, my grandmother would karate chop me. The Jane Addams projects. So I spent a lot of time there in the 1980s as a kid because my grandmother and my great aunts were there. So for me, the work is all about the context of looking back to see why the West Side is the way it is, why this life expectancy gap is there. It's because of disinvestment and structural racism, which in a lot of ways came into play at this period that you write so beautifully about. And I just got the book today, okay? So I haven't referenced it, but I know Liz's work through the many paths that we've crossed. So for me, that is very important. Thinking about the dismantling of these historical systems that have been put in place. And also, some of my research in looking at the Great Migration, I came across a study that looked at the life expectancy gap between those that stayed in the South and those that came here. And there's a difference there. Those that came here tended to die sooner because of what they encountered in the migration. So for me, that thread is the connective tissue with the food equity work that we do. We talk a lot about, and we use soul food, how that was the food of the slaves. We made scraps into delicacies that we still eat today. But in the food equity work, it was about giving people vegan options or options to use turkey instead of ham hocks, or ways to modify those recipes in communities that were food deserts or that had the highest rates of heart disease, diabetes, those sorts of things, was embedded in the work to provide better options. complications. My father, as great as a man that he was, and the work that he did over decades in Chicago, passed away from complications of heart disease and diabetes, and that was related to diet. And so, when we look at life expectancy gap, it's not just about access to health and health care. It's about neighborhood and physical environment. It's about which in that we talk about food access, we talk about the landscape and green space or lack thereof, the empty lots, affordable housing. Our goal is to decrease this gap by 50% by 2030. And in talking to community in this work, they're like, well, am I going to be here in 2030? Can I afford to stay in this community? And so, the work all takes us back to these historical contexts in which we got to where we are in 2019. And so for me, I'm fortunate in my little brain to have made the connective dots between what that means for me when I teach the arts. I was the students that did the walkout in 2010 at Austin High School, those were my kids. And I didn't know about what happened in 1968 until tonight. So it's like the connection and the history and the spirit. I feel like I'm being guided by the ancestors in history, and I don't even know it. So I'm just really trying to make sure young people are empowered, that communities are empowered, using a historical framework, calling out power. For Westside United, it's great that health institutions have come together and recognized that they have disinvested and ignored 10 communities in their backyard, and that if they're really going to bring about change, they have to be more intentional and bring community into the forefront. So for me, I will always reference what happened in 1968, 69, 55, 43, 27, and find the connection to 2019. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was just, because I'm looking at him, I wanted to also shout out Danton Floyd and his work on the west side at Sumner Elementary School with 360 Nation. And some of the things that were being mentioned up here made me think a lot about the work that Danton's doing with young people at Sumner, and these ideas similar to what you were talking about, right? About using this history as a usable past that's empowering for them to take back land. They're clearing lots. And this summer, I had the opportunity to participate on a day when they were resurfacing, that ain't the right word, tilling, something like that. But putting down different layers of materials to try to regenerate the soil that was there. And I'm thinking about this hair example. I'm like, Danton, you got to get up on this hair game. Or the work that he's done, and I was able to participate in a very small form, that the students found this large bin of photographs of that elementary school over time. And some of these photographs dated back to the 1940s. And they were able to start to build, with his assistants, this art and the other, volunteers there, this archive of not just their school, but their community, and ask different questions about the space that they're in. One day when I was there with them, we walked around. There's a building that's occupied, and like many schools that have been depopulated, a building that's not fully occupied. And we walked around the old building, probably in some places we weren't supposed to be, but we found like old pianos that have been sitting in basements for years. And one of the things that, to your point about how history can tell us something about these things, in my interviews, one of the things I found with older teachers is that they mentioned to me that at one point in time, as a primary grades teacher, you had to be able to play the piano. And so these old pianos probably dated back from those times. We're finding old textbooks. The question of when they were used is probably a different question, probably more recently than they should have. But it's soliciting the students to ask these questions about, like, why are the depictions of Africa in this book as, primitive peoples, and all types of other questions that allow them to see where they are as a place of value, learn about where they are, and build on that. So I definitely wanted to shout out his work, another West Sider, doing that really important work that's connecting young people with their history and really empowering them to build there too, and also to recognize Hull-House as a space where the group of students from 360 Nation actually came came and did an exhibit here at Hull-House that was really awesome. And just to see them in here presenting that work was a really exciting experience. So there's lots of people, again, to my final point, there are so many people in the city doing such important work. And I think finding the ways to more adequately resource this work and really give it voice and platform for other folks to know and be able to network amongst each other is something really important.
Thank you for that. You guys have some questions, thoughts, and okay, we'll get to them in a minute. I just wanted to make sure you all are thinking about it. What I want to do, though, Elizabeth, coming back to you, one of the things, and just in context, back in the 60s, North Lawndale was 120,000 people. Today, it's less than 36,000. It was the headquarters for Sears Roebuck and Company, the international headquarters for Sears Roebuck, for Magic Kiss, for Western Electric, for a number of businesses, for Ryerson Steel. Dr. King was killed in 1968. Dr. King lived in Lawndale in 1966. There was immediate civil unrest because that happened. Fred Hampton was also killed on the west side, as Prexy referred to. By 1980, all those businesses were gone. And so the middle class existences that were built from these businesses, from the teaching profession, from all, make this a very different kind of community today. You talked about the number of black teachers that were engaged in CPS before the school closings, before all the charters and all that happened. Can you talk a bit more about then and now, what happened to them and how that causes and plays into the decimation of this in these communities?
Sure. I mean, I think so. One of the things, and you sort of started touching on this, Prexy, about what I think is one of the things that's unique about Chicago is the way that black teachers organized in the city in a number of different organizations. Again, not just for themselves as educators, but also on behalf of their students, and were successful. So the influx of black teachers into Chicago public schools, such that they would become a majority of certified teachers, or I shouldn't say majority, there were more, they never were a proportional majority, but there were more in numbers, in greater numbers than white teachers by the mid-'80s, is a direct reflection of this organizing work. And it's not something that you see in other large cities, places like New York that also had a significant black student population. You never see that same influx of black teachers into the system. And also to your point about this was a struggle not just against the Board of Education, but also against the Chicago Teachers Union during these days. In 1969, black teachers crossed the picket lines, almost half of black teachers crossed the picket lines when the Chicago Teachers Union went on their first strike, and Operation Breadbasket, of which Hannibal Afrique was a part, said that, and this is a paraphrasing, but it was something like, we see the Board of Education, and this is the quote part, and the Chicago Teachers Union as two heads of the same snake of institutional racism. And so I think that very much was their orientation, and because of that crossing of picket lines, it forced not only the Board of Education to take notice, but also the Chicago Teachers Union to take notice of and make greater efforts to incorporate black educators across the ranks and certainly into the leadership ranks of the Teachers Union. This was also pressured by desegregation mandates, both at the state and federal level. So I think you see those things working together to really push for a greater number and proportion of black teachers in CPS than other places. And if you look at the Board of Education more broadly, beyond just teachers, for a large period of time after that, African Americans make up the majority of Board of Education employees. So clerks, cafeteria workers, building services, people working in central office and district offices. And I think that matters because not just in the teaching force, but nationally, public sector employment is a niche sector of employment for black people and has been since really the middle of the 20th century. When African Americans could not get jobs in private industry or other spaces, they were able to make influxes into the public sector. And so much of the black middle class, as it was growing beginning in the mid 20th century, was because of public sector employment and the stability of public sector employment, the pensions provided by public sector employment that provided some sense sense of stability in communities that were struggling in all types of other ways that people talk about at the time as the urban crisis. And so I think the attacks on the public sector generally and the teaching profession specifically in places like Chicago have had a adverse and disproportionate impact on Black communities. Cuts in public sector employment have a disproportionate impact on Black workers. And these things, again, don't just matter for the professions per se, but also for the communities in which people live, where they can no longer afford to frequent local businesses, where they can no longer afford their mortgage payments or rent payments, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it really does have a profound impact, these changes and shifts. On the other hand, I would like to offer, I think there are actually ways to change this quite dramatically. There are certainly issues that exist in colleges of education. Anyone who's here in a college of education knows this in terms of what the pipeline looks like and the racial demographics of education pipelines. But there are other ways that we could think about changing things. For example, in the city of Chicago, what if Chicago public schools in hiring teachers prioritized hiring their own graduates? Chicago public schools is almost 90% students of color. If they prioritize hiring their own graduates, that would immediately diversify the teaching force, right? You can also think of other ways, more intentional recruitment efforts at HBCUs and Hispanic serving institutions. Because I should also say at this point in time, Chicago Public Schools' largest single population are Latinx students, who make up almost 46% of the student population and only about a little over 20% of the teaching field. So there's an intense need, and I will say CPS, one of the programs that they have that I think has a lot of promise is a program around teacher recruitment that tries to take paraprofessionals and give them the training necessary to become full-time certified teachers. And I think there are ways in which programs like that, programs like Grow Your Own, could be built upon to take folks who are already living in these communities in our city, who are already invested in schools, particularly when you think of folks like paraprofessionals, who if you know a school, that's the bread and butter of your school. That's the lifeline of your school, your paraprofessionals, the folks who live in the communities that are being served, and find ways to provide avenues for them to become teachers, I think could be really powerful levers of change to really try to change that dynamic and paradigm that we see.
Thank you for that. Prexy, Ayesha, I want to get some additional comments from you because I know there are people out here and I want to make sure we get their questions and thoughts in. But
I'd prefer to just go to the folk out there that have been listening to us too long.
Yes.
Great. I saw a hand. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. First and foremost, I want to say I'm honored to be looking at my mentor who got me through high school working with youth outreach services, Ayesha Jaco. She's the reason why I went to college and was confident in having a voice. And then this gentleman may not remember me, but at Green Tomato Cafe while I was getting my master's, we were sitting across from each other at a table, and he was like, "What are you studying?" And he took an interest in what I was studying and spoke to me about how important it was to look back from where you came and from your elders and really find a way to grasp that information and move forward and help others. So I'm like, this is full circle. I'm so honored to be here. I'm here with the DePaul social work students. We'll be graduating and going into the workforce. And something that has happened is that we hear so much about the negative things that are happening to youth and people of color and people who are experiencing poverty. And it's overwhelming. And we're going to graduate and go into these communities. We're not teachers, but how can we advocate, support, or move forward to kind of turn this around and really be of service to the kids that will be our future, ultimately?
I think one of the things that I'd suggest is very quick and very, very simple. We have to respect each other. There is a minimum of respect, really, that happens. I'm often struck by the difference between being an elder in countries on the African continent and being an elder here in Chicago. You know, I like the expression when young brothers will come up to me and they'll say, "Old school, who you think you are?" Well, that's nice. It's cute. But old school also has some things to say and share that I'd really like to. And that has to emanate from much more respect. And we don't need schools to create that. We need to love each other, to know each other's history. The most profound absence, of course, is around the attitude we have toward women. And that is scurrilous. It is nothing short of scurrilous and clearly related to the amounts and levels of violence against women that goes on in this country. We don't need schools to set new standards on how we relate to each other.
Thank you.
I would say focus on the resiliency of the young people that you're serving. So go in honoring that and helping them build from that, because that's how I survived. You know, we grew up in a community in East Garfield Park where my older brother lost 25 friends over a 10-year period within a 2.5-mile block radius. But, you know, at the same time, my mom had National Geographic books, the Sphinx, like people thought our house was a museum in this little public housing complex. They gave us the ability to dream, know our history, and know what it was that we could contribute. So if you go in knowing that the glass is half full, that'll help for you. Think about where you came from in Austin and how you made it through. How did you get through school? What pushed you? And then call out folks in authority that have resources. Well, not call them out, but make alliances. You know, and be creative, be strategic. These young people are, they're creative, right? They're going to teach you. Let it be a reciprocal process as well. You're not the expert. You're going to learn from them and coexist and grow together. Those are things that I take with me in my toolkit.
You want to add something, Elizabeth?
No, we can put more questions.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Bonnie McEwen, and I write a blog for the Austin Weekly News called West Side Blues. And one of the things I found out in researching the blues is that there is such a lack of appreciation for it right in this city. In fact, there was an article in Crane's Business Magazine that said Chicago is losing millions of dollars every year for failure to promote its own music. And the reason is racism, because the music is not valued because it's African American. But the blues is the root of all American popular music. And the blues was the voice when African Americans had a pretty rough time that they couldn't even talk about what was going on, so they sang about it. Some of the greatest musicians in the world came from the west side of Chicago. So when I was writing about this, I found that there was very much of a lack of research about the west side. Hardly even mentioned. Really appreciative what you're doing. And maybe somebody could comment on the fact also that not only did these musicians growing up have their elders to teach them, but they also had good school teachers. They had good music programs in schools coming up in the 60s, and so much of the music has been taken out of the schools.
Yeah, I think that, you know, there was some controversy over where to locate a blues museum here in the city, right? And questions about why it would end up being located in a central area as opposed to in the communities where so much of this music was generated. There were controversies over this in the ultimate closing of what was Maxwell Street Market, and the history of blues and the generation of blues that came out of that space. And I think when you were mentioning your point about music programs, it made me think back to working with Danton and the young people at Sumner. And one of the things we were seeing in these photographs, looking across the photographs that the students asked about, I think they were photos from the 70s, and they were, because we were categorizing by decade, or attempting to categorize by decade. And they were like, oh, Sumner used to have a band? I want to play in a band. Why don't we have a band, right? And these are the questions you want your young people to be asking, and you want to be able to have better answers for them than the ones that we have available to us. So I think your point is well taken.
I say so much about schools is about resources. And the whole push, I believe, with integration was because there were more resources in white schools than there were in black schools. And how do we get more resources? How do we get equal resources? A lot of the conversation since then has been as resources have seemed to evaporate. How do we continue to educate without negatively impacting the classroom? And so it's done with mirrors and tricks, but the reality is all of these things impact the classroom. And there's so much that happens in music that helps you with math, that helps you with logic. And to think that those things don't impact the classroom is foolhardy. So the push that we all have to continue to do is to fight for more resources in our schools, because there's simply not enough, and they're not enough going into the right places. Yes.
Hello, testing. Okay. As mentioned, I'm here with the DePaul MSW program. My name is Derry Givens. Considering that there are several social issues in Chicago that exist today, just to name a few, like gentrification, segregation, school closing, and gun violence, what suggestions might you have for our new elected politicians or local politicians that can help to improve our education system?
Yeah, it's like a light question. I think from my perspective, to the point about resources, I think the commentary around Chicago not having money is questionable, and we should continue to challenge it. There's money for large-scale billion-dollar redevelopment projects in some neighborhoods, while there's not money for basic resources in other neighborhoods. And so what really needs to be demanded is a fundamental redistribution of wealth in our city, and that should be something that our government takes the lead at, and that we as part of the citizenry have to push for them too and keep them accountable to doing that if they suggest in some ways that they have some interest in that, and investing in different communities. I think the other thing, people talk a lot about gentrification in the city, and I think gentrification is certainly an issue in many communities, but I think the twin to gentrification is abandonment. And I think so many of our communities, particularly communities on the west side, are still suffering, as you mentioned, since '68, if not frankly before then, from abandonment of all types of different institutions, both public and private, commercial development, job opportunities. And so I think we need to be vigilant about what it means to rebuild communities with community at the table as part of that decision-making process. And again, to demand these things. Power concedes nothing without demand, and so we have to continue to demand these things.
And we have to be specific. So a broad conversation that people have about, we need to do something on the south side and west side. Thanks for recognizing us, but that's not enough. Mm-hmm. So we have to be very specific about telling them what it is that we need in these places, and what it is that we need in these spaces, and what the time frame is that it makes sense for those things to happen in. But we have to be very specific, or we will continue to get broad platitudes about what can be without real efforts being made, without real progress happening, because we've kind of been here. And as we look at Lawndale, Dr. King was killed in 1968, and everything's gone. And I can still point out vacant lots that have existed since then, too many of them. So we have to be very specific with it, what it is that we ask. You guys want to add anything?
I think we have to deal with race in the city of Chicago. Mm-hmm. We need to have what they did in South Africa was a truth commission. This is it was in 1919 that they had the race riot, the big race riot, because there are many race riots that take place in Chicago all the time. The police attitude towards black communities is a race riot attitude. They go out to work sensing that they're going to war against communities that they occupy. There is no view of that community as being human. The banking institutions of this city, how scandalous can it be that you can't find a major bank going west in Lawndale at all? Not a single major bank in this now, at this point in time. And so I think that one of the things we need to do, and I hope the new mayor will think about that, is to have maybe section by section, city block by block, ward by ward, serious discussions and histories of race in this city, where there has been so much that has been done. A beginning has been done. And that beginning is the fact that now you have to teach about Fred Burge and what Fred Burge and that torture machine did. John Burge, I'm sorry, excuse me, John or Burge, Fred. But that's only a beginning. And the police hate that. And there are communities in this city that hate it. But we've got to re-educate those. And I must say, I think this is an area in which the church has been very lax. It could play a tremendous role in trying to deal with this before it's too late, before it gets really, really violent and ugly.
I would just say a lot of what you mentioned, the root causes are what we are looking at for Westside United when you talk about violence. And I did work, if you're familiar with the Wear Orange movement now, anybody? That started with work that we did at the Jacob Carruthers Center for Inner City Studies, working with friends of Hydea Pendleton. And at the time it was called Project Orange Tree, led by her friends. And it was a 4-day protest. It was April 1st through the 4th. And so we asked people to wear orange because orange is the color that hunters wear to signify don't shoot. And it was a fast from April 1st through the 4th, fasting for those that were no longer here because of gun violence. And the last day was the day King was assassinated. And so we honored that as well. So we had people from all over the world, Ghana, Japan, posting pictures of their orange. But what the young people came out saying that it's because there are no grocery stores. It's because we don't know how to grieve. Like the young man that died in my community, we were right down the street from the Bobby E. Wright Center. But there were no resources there to help us work through that. So with Westside United, we're looking at land usage, affordable housing. We're looking at building up the local economy on the West Side, restoring those communities that were never rebuilt. We're looking at education, right? We're looking at things that lead up to that, using community voice as a driver, side by side, leading the way. People are tired of big institutions coming in, dictating what they need, or dropping a bag of money and then they leave, or the funding stops and the problem is still there. So we're trying to be more proactive about how we approach the work to get at some of that. But as mentioned here, it does take intention. It takes people listening. It takes us empowering those that have been there. In one of our programs, we have a medical pathways program where hospitals said, if we have people retiring in entry-level non-clinical positions 30 years later, going to a community that they can't afford to live in, we are supporting the problem. So let's offer pathway programs that allow people in those positions to apply to become medical assistants, to then become nursing assistants, to then become registered nurses. So it takes people in positions of power to call out their privilege and really make good on what the best thing is to do. And those came from talking to those workers, talking to the community, and that's a small step. But in the work that I'm doing, I can't do that work without referencing my experience as a West Sider and how we got to that point.
So the answer to politicians is we vote them in, we make demands. If they don't follow them, we vote them out. Next question. Yes, sir. Close your mouth.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for putting this presentation together tonight. I've lived in Chicago most of my life, and these were things that you guys spoke about tonight that I wasn't even aware of. In particular, I liked your focus, talked about segregation and desegregation. But a lot of people, when you're taught in high school or even in grade school about American history, African American history, there's kind of a focus on desegregation as though it's a fix-all, and it really isn't, because it wasn't separate but equal, and it wasn't desegregated but equal, and we still see that inequality today. So my question is, I know there's a focus on, the lack of funding in Chicago, but really it's on a federal level. Specifically, I wanted to ask your opinion about some of the legislation we've seen in the last 2 decades. And specifically what I'm talking about is No Child Left Behind and now currently Common Core. Because in my opinion, these programs are designed to take funding and resources from schools that are already struggling. And I know the opinion on this has changed over the past maybe decade or so, but on standardized testing, because you're using the word standardized. But we all know that in certain communities, like here, education isn't standard. If I grew up in the Gold Coast, the opportunities and the standard of education is very different than out here on the West Side. And, what's your opinion on that? And then how do we approach not only educating people about that, because people hear these federal laws and they don't really understand what they're doing, and then how do we combat that?
Do you want to start? Okay. Okay. So I think you make some really good points, and particularly around this question of the impact of No Child Left Behind. So one thing to understand about education and education funding is the vast majority of funding for public education comes from the local level. After that, it's state, and then the smallest amount really is from the federal government. But those federal dollars are important, and to your point, also the standards are important. So the idea of having, I think it's attractive to hear this idea that, all students should meet some basic standard of achievement or growth, whether it's growth or achievement. This idea that there should be some universal standard sounds like something that logically makes sense. But when there's no mechanisms or funding put in place for students and teachers and school districts to meet those marks that are being put up there, and then on the back end when they're being punitively dealt with if they don't, I think that's where we see the problems in these policies come into place. And so I think it's not just a question of does there need to be more federal dollars for money, but that we really need to rethink the way that we're funding schools generally. The property tax model systemically disinvests people of color, systemically, is negative and has disproportionately negative impacts on low-income people across the board, and really just non-wealthy districts generally. And so this is part of the problem fundamentally with the way that public education is funded. And on top of that, we're in the state of Illinois, where up until the last year or two, when they've started to implement a new funding pattern, we have for years been at the very bottom 1, 2, or 3 in terms of the proportion of state money that goes towards funding local public education. And so when we're saying funding, I think it is important also to talk about those different levels and how we might attack and address new types of funding formulas in all of those spaces.
And you mentioned No Child Left Behind, which Margaret Spellings under George Bush and her predecessor came up with that notion of making sure that our children throughout were being tested, so we knew even in a school where the differences were with black children, Latino children, white children, how they were performing. What that did was truly create a test nation. And so we spent a lot of time testing and spent a lot of time getting ready for tests. So that is when you start to look at whatever is happening, you are not getting more content by learning how to take a test. And that has been problematic through our education departments, through our education system, ever since No Child Left Behind came up. And so when Arnie came to DC, his thought was this race to the top, which then had everybody competing for the small federal dollars that were there, which still didn't add more to what we needed to make things happen. And now we are blessed with Betsy DeVos. And I don't have a clue as to what it is that people are supposed to do now, because it really doesn't seem like there's a seriousness to the education system that there should be, particularly looking at what we need in the communities that we talk about.
Can I just one other thing on this point about testing? I think it's also important to note when we're talking about funding and money around public education, particularly in our current context and over the course of the last 20 to 30 years, people are making money, profits off of public education that are not being reinvested into the communities most in need. So when we talk about testing, there is a huge multi-billion-dollar testing industry that is built off of and has worked around these types of laws that are being put forth. And I think in addition to that, you see the ways that, like, in all different modes of the shift of public funds into private hands, people are profiting. And generally, and there's a scholar named Noliwe Rooks who talks about this, and I like her term. She calls this segronomics. That segregation is profitable. Segregation is profitable in housing, where you can exploit people and make profits regardless of the quality of people's housing. Segregation is profitable in education, where if more tests are needed, just keep making these tests and have school systems keep buying them. It doesn't matter whether students' test scores improve or not, they still need those tests and more of them. So there are all these ways in which people are profiting off of the segregation that exists. So I don't want to make it seem as if though segregation is benign. Segregation is in no way benign, but I think some of the folks who are addressing and trying to attack issues in education question the on-the-ground benefits of what desegregation would look like in the context in which it was being actually provided. So again, if we think back to 1980 here in Chicago, the plans for school desegregation, their mark was to make 100% white schools go down to 70%. That's what desegregation would look like. What does that really mean, you know? And so I think those are the spaces in which people are questioning desegregation. But segregation is not benign. Segregation is violent, and segregation exploits people, and many people are making lots of profit off the maintenance of segregation in all types of different spheres of American life.
Yeah.
You hear me?
No. Here you go. I'll share that with you.
Okay, now. I feel like DePaul has come into UIC right now. I'm a doctoral student in the education department at DePaul. But I don't actually want to talk about that. Oddly, I want to shift gears, if that's okay, to a couple things. We talk about resources, and a lot of times we're talking about something financial. And then something that Ayesha said, she talked about resilience. I'm more interested in the speakers, particularly Ayesha and Elizabeth, talking more about Black community wealth and assets, particularly around cultural wealth. There's a lot of things that white people do very poorly that Black people do very well. And that's just a cultural reality that is very difficult to identify when financial resources are low. But that is what has sustained, I think, communities when financial wealth has not been present. So I wanted to know if you could talk more about that, how those things have persisted through history and then even into today, and how that can be built upon.
Well, you mentioned the blues, which I found had roots in Mali. That was like in Africa, West Africa. That's where the first guitar was. And then it came, in the Mississippi Delta, it thrived there. And a lot of those people like Muddy Waters came up, and a lot of people got pimped for their work. And, when you go to the Blues Fest now in Chicago and you look who's in the audience, it's not people that have roots in the Delta. I have a brother that was in the recording business, and the game of the record industry and how it tried to take his soul for his art. That's very real. But at the same time, we started a pen pal program with students at Austin High School back in maybe 2009 with students in Seoul, South Korea. And that came off of a trip to Asia that I had a chance to go to South Korea and Seoul, and I was just amazed because all the young people there look like the young people on 63rd and Halsted, out west, with how they were dressed, what they were listening to. My sisters love K-pop. I'm like, that's nothing but 90s R&B. But okay, I'm rolling with you. So we built a program to tell young people, you matter. Do you know that what you're doing right here is influencing the world? That urban culture drives pop culture, and it's been that way since we've been on this earth. And so that was a way to build resiliency and show young people, their brilliance by taking them to other spaces to call that out and then own it. But when you talk about ownership, and you talk about the industry, Lupe Fiasco had to fight a 360 deal. Right, and that means that the label owns your music. If you do a shoe, they own that. If you do anything related to the brand that they help you build, they own it. So we have to fight. I have people that want to go into cosmetology. There's a sponge that's really popular that we use to coil up our hair. And there was a black company that developed that out of Detroit or Dallas. And so what happens is, they came to the Black Women's Expo and they were like, oh, well, now it's in the beauty shops or beauty stores in the community and they sell them for $2. And so we can't make a profit because it's been co-opted or someone else has replicated it. So when we talk about exporting our culture and owning what we put out there, it's not as easy. But part of that is teaching young people the business behind manufacturing and owning our culture so that it's not co-opt. And that's something that we've not figured out for quite some time.
Yeah, I think in the educational space and in some of the folks that I look at historically, certainly these are people that are making a way out of no way. You can go back in a long history of Black education to folks having enslaved people, having clandestine schools, people after Reconstruction, when white missionaries would come down to the South and find that African Americans had already started their own schools with what meager resources and space they had. So I think that, folks have a long history of making a way, African Americans in particular, of making a way out of no way, and in the education realm in particular. And I think related to that, if I think about some of the people that I was talking about today, Barbara Sizemore, Hannibal Afrique, they were not always necessarily in the best resource spaces, but they had a fundamental belief that Black children were brilliant, that they had things to offer, that they were going to learn from their students as well, that they had things to impart to their students, that students had all types of skills and talents and abilities that they felt it was their responsibility to try to hone in whatever way made the most sense. And sometimes there were different strategies about what that might look like. So I think it is important to address today our young people as people not with deficits, but as with, as people that have so much to offer, and young people that have so much to offer. But I think that we can hold that at the same time that we hold and fight for more resources. Because the other thing that the history of Black education tells me is that many different sort of efforts at reform have been put forward: desegregation, community control, independent institutions, and always as part of what that proposal or strategy included was and more resources. And the part that's picked up on is the strategy, the culturally relevant education, the drawing on students' talents, and never the more resources part, right? And so I think these folks were saying these things have to be tied together. They are not separate, but need to be sutured together. And so I think that we can hold up the brilliance of young people and what they have to offer at the same time, and that we hold up the fact that they deserve so much more.
If I can really quickly, I would also like to point out an example of a Nipsey Hussle, right? That brilliant mind, that resiliency, oh my God, that resiliency in Crenshaw to build himself up and do that and then be assassinated. What he represented is what you spoke about, right? And so we have thousands of Nipseys on the west side, south side, and so it's about, just building a mechanism to honor that struggle and continuing to support them. And when we look at people like Sam Cooke and others that really try to own their music and empower people, those were the ones that faced a lot of the biggest struggles. So I just had to put Brother Nipsey out there, as you mentioned it.
Thank you. So it's 8:04. We're supposed to end at 8 o'clock. But we're good if you all are good. We're good?
Can we just take Mary's question?
We're good.
So
Absolutely.
This is probably a good question to comment in on. If we don't vote, I was a resident in Prexy's building in the 60s, and I remember the precinct captain coming and trying to get me to register to vote, and I was a teenager or a young adult, and I was ready to sign up, and Prexy said, "No, we don't vote, we're communists." I said, "No, I'm not voting, I'm a communist." Well, I probably am still, a socialist, but I vote. And I think we have to be really aware that much of what, if you've got 20% or 30% of your electorate coming out to vote, we will continue to live with the conditions that we live with. I don't believe, and I never will believe as a socialist, that voting is a thing that saves us. We save ourselves. But somewhere it has to involve serious look at our public policy and how do we shape our public policy as opposed to letting others sort of shape our policy and give it to us. And I just hope that we have a very little bit of time left to get rid of this ugly administration. And we better start talking about it. We better start doing something. I don't know during Republicans in the room, but I'm sorry.
I think that one of the things that I reflect on now more and more is that I think behind the schools, behind the question of access to resources, behind the inequities, there's a much bigger question. And it's a question that has to do with the fact that we are in a nation that manufactures as many guns as it does and provides the world with those guns. And that the education system that we have doesn't really challenge those things. And I think that we just saw the loss of one of the most wonderful institutions educationally that we have in this country. And that was the attack on the place in Tennessee, Highlander Institute, which had hosted people like Paulo Freire and the whole SNCC movement and all these people who were saying, oh, wait a minute, what's the bigger question that's involved in all of this? And I really think there is a much bigger question that we have to constantly keep in front of us. It has a lot to do with languages. I'm convinced that part of the narrowness of this country is rooted in the fact that we so seldom use languages, that we have insignificant parts of our whole population who speak Spanish, but yet we don't require our whole country to learn Spanish. It's about the narrowness of our vision, and I really think we have to challenge that. And that has to do with the whole bigger picture of the relationship between capital and education. You know, when I was at Parker School, I could never understand when I went to Francis Parker up there where they pay $35,000 a year to put kindergartners in. Isn't that right? I could never understand how come I didn't do well on these damn tests we took all the time. And what I didn't realize was that the parents up there spend millions of dollars on providing other support to their children to take these tests. And also we're learning they spend millions of dollars to put their children into other schools to just get them in there. And what I think that raises is the whole fundamental question of what is an education for? And I think it's about helping each other. It's not just about advancing yourself. So it's called a political education. It's for sale here. She can autograph them. But before we stop, I would like to have a final thought from you.
Oh, well, I'd say building on Prexy's comments, I just encourage us all to expand our visions and what we can dream and vision for not just ourselves, but for our communities. For me, that's always been very deeply inspired by history in the past, but find what inspires you to broaden your vision for what a more just society might look like. And I think together we all need to work where we can, when we can, to get there, and to get there together.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give a hand to our panel. And please share some love with Jennifer Scott and the fine staff of the Hull-House who put this all together.